Supreme Court decision in 1966. So this whole court ushered in a new set of judicial protections of the right of the accused. Now, in the Shepard case, Bailey's crusade against the forces of oppression and self-serving corruption was personified in his combative approach to Gerber and Seltzer, the coroner and the press baron, as representatives of what he considered to be 1950s inquisitorial. Speaking of Gerber, Bailey wrote, "He is an extremely frightened little man. Crushing him into infamy will be a distinct pleasure." Over the course of the next 3 years, Bailey pursued a dogged campaign to take the Shepard cause to the federal and then ultimately to the Supreme Court level. In a 1963 petition to the Supreme Court, Bailey drew attention to the elective basis of Ohio judgeships, in other words, the political nature of the legal and criminal system, and other key investigative and prosecutorial office holders, and the way in which these office holders, these politicians, had effectively been exploited by the press baron, Louis Seltzer. Among other prejudicial features of the media coverage, Bailey cited the 1954 trial judge's decision to permit law enforcement officers to testify that Shepard had refused to take a polygraph test, despite the fact, he wrote, that such evidence has been ruled incompetent and prejudicial by every jurisdiction in the United States. So Bailey's efforts were rewarded when, on the 6th of June 1966, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled on what is now considered to be a landmark judgment on the dangers of prejudicial pretrial publicity, that is Shepard versus Maxwell. The majority opinion was forthright in its condemnation of the Cleveland establishment's witch-finding excesses. So this is a quote from the majority judgment. From the outset, officials focused on suspicion on Shepard. After a search of the house and the premises on the morning of the tragedy, Dr. Gerber told his men, "Well, it's evident that the doctor did this, so let's go get the confession out of him." Asked by an officer to take the lie detector test, Shepard said he would if it were reliable. The officer replied that it was infallible, and you may as well tell us now all about it. So that's from the Supreme Court decision. The decision concluded by ordering that Shepard be either retried or released. Ohio chose the former. So there was a second Shepard trial, which opened in October 1966. And at its opening, it was immediately evident that this trial would be conducted in a framework that self-consciously repudiated the circumstances that had prevailed a decade earlier. The judge delivered a preliminary ruling imposing strict limits on press reporting, and this reflected a wider sense of a generational shift in which 50s inquisitorialism yielded to 60s freedoms. Bailey himself devised his trial strategy to emphasize precisely this shift. The first defense, the 54 defense, had refrained, for example, from pursuing evidence of Marilyn's marital infidelities, thereby reifying her image, public image, as an ideal wife, while leaving Sam exposed to puritanical attacks on his very well-documented extramarital affairs. Bailey would have no such compunction. Quote, he told Sam, "Everybody either loved you or hated you in 1954. This time, I'm going to get younger people on that jury, and they won't have those feelings." So the scene was set for Bailey to finally showcase the testimony of Paul Kirk, who, as Bailey later called, was our star in the courtroom. Quote, "Working with Dr. Kirk was a pleasure. We were like a pair of basketball guards, so keyed to each other's moves that it was almost impossible to miss a pass. On the witness stand, Kirk confidently rehearsed the findings of his blood investigations that he had detailed so meticulously in his judicially excluded 1955 affidavit. Now, you'll be pleased to know that I'm not going to go into the second trial and the details of Shepard's testimony. It was basically what it is that was in his affidavit. So I don't need to go into details on that testimony. Instead, I'm going to use the reappearance of Kirk's Spatter evidence to make a couple of concluding observations. First, and pretty straightforwardly, was the way that Bailey used it, the Kirk evidence, to fulfill his long-standing ambition of crushing Gerber into infamy. In extensive cross-examination, Bailey repeatedly led the aging coroner to admit that his 1954 sensational claims to have discerned the impression of a surgical instrument on the bloodstained pillow could not be substantiated. In one such exchange, Bailey asked Gerber to tell the jury what surgical instrument you see impressed on that pillow. What is the nature of it, please? I can't give you the name of it because I don't know what it is, Gerber meekly replied. Second, it's worth reflecting on the comparative standing of Kirk's Spatter evidence and that of the polygraph in the 1966 retrial. As I've suggested, Kirk's courtroom testimony, the Spatter testimony, was presented as the exemplar of modern forensics. Yeah, it was, as Bailey declared in his final summation, the touchstone of truth. Quote, he sees things, Kirk sees things that should have been seen long before, but never were. The jury seemed to concur on the 16th of November, 1966. After less than a day of deliberation, it found Sam Sheppard not guilty of Marilyn's murder. The polygraph, by contrast to the blood spatter evidence, made no direct contribution to the outcome, to the verdict. It wasn't mentioned in court. So the question then becomes, does this mean that all the discussions that has been focused on this alternative truth technology, the lie detector, the polygraph, including what I've given you today, was to no real effect? Well, yes and no. I mean, that's what historians always say when they're asked a question. Yes and no. Yes, if we restrict our attention to what transpired in the courtroom itself. But, as historians have pretty conclusively established, the power of the polygraph as an instrument of forensic inquiry in 20th century America didn't stem from its formal role in direct trial evidence. Indeed, it was actually, because it was formally excluded from case proceedings, again, since 1923 in the Fry ruling, but it was in fact this very exclusion that created the conditions for its cultural power, for its cultural impact. That is, it was the polygraph's extrajudicial uses, its promise to deliver a form of technological divination at, for example, police interrogations or pretrial plea bargain hearings that made it such a powerful technology and such a powerful tool of the law. And in the case of Sam Sheppard, without the leverage provided by the promise of this oracular form of evidence, in order to access, evidentiary access that was lodged in the hands of this self-appointed posse of cold warriors for truth, the Court of Last Resort, and Gardner's sheriff badge, the revelations of Spatter would have remained confined within the walls of Kirk's Berkeley laboratory. Okay, so what? Okay, so that's what I told you a story. Why do I think it's interesting? So I'll do that by returning to the observation that I made at the outset as a way of indicating my broader intentions for engaging with this singular instance in forensic cultures at work. And that is to say, or to repeat, that we live today in an age of recovered innocence, exemplified in the work of the Innocence Project, dramatized in popular, compulsively watched docuseries. The writing of wrongful conviction has emerged as a powerful feature of our contemporary times. For most observers, It's the product of a combination of forces that are constitutive of and specific to, particular to, our contemporary world. Principled critique of the workings and biases of the criminal justice system, rigorous investigative journalism, and improved forensic techniques, most notably DNA typing. Yet, as I've suggested this evening, recovered innocence has a much more interesting history than that, and this is what I'm planning to spend my time on in the woods in North Carolina, trying to work up next year by examining what structured, animated, and legitimated Gardner's campaign for reform, legal reform in post-war America and American justice. I want to try to tease out the underlying logic of a prior framework, a prior matrix of innocence, developed within a markedly different political, legal, cultural, and scientific context than our own, but sharing many of today's structural features: reformist ideal, media advocacy, and the promise of science-driven revelation. So it's my hope that this historical framework can then be used to rethink the assumptions that undergird much of the public and indeed many practitioner understandings of today's regime of innocence, that only now, with DNA, can we actually really reach objectively into the past and to identify and rectify historical wrongs. Though, of course, cases of exoneration are to be entirely celebrated, the view that these are enabled simply by and solely by present regimes of forensic exceptionalism at once fetishizes scientific progress and draws attention away from the far more complex and historically situated conditions that arguably undergird all moments of innocence, including that of our own. So with that, I'll thank you for your attention, and I'll look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much to Professor Burney for a fascinating talk. We have time for some questions now. Can I just say that if anybody has any questions about covering their tracks, they will be treated with the utmost suspicion and reported to the police. So we do have some roving microphones. So do we have some questions? We have one in the middle.
Hiya, have you ever taken a lie detector test yourself?
Have I taken a lie detector test? No, I haven't, and I'm glad I haven't. But actually, the interesting thing is that I think that I would pass it, and it's because I know that lie detector tests don't work, unless you believe they do. As I know they don't, I'd pass.
Just one there and then one down the front.
If you could put you mentioned a percentage early on that was 4% on the hair, which you could maybe explain. But just nowadays, where have forensics come from then? You know, in terms of being confident, you know, in terms of the outcome, or you know, sort of percentage-wise, and where we are today,
right?
In your belief. And
Sure. So that was today. I mean, that was. I mean, unless you don't think that 2015 is today. That was today, and so the headline is the FBI experts get it wrong 96% of the time, right? And the consequence there is that some forms of forensics, which are staples of investigation and have been going for decades and decades and decades, are actually the source of potentially the source of wrongful conviction. And to my mind, and I'm not alone in this, that is actually an artifact of a revolution in forensics which has occurred since DNA profiling first hit the headlines in the mid-'80s, and basically was then developed and kind of stabilized in the '90s and early 2000s. From the point of view of DNA, what is known now condescendingly as forensic identification techniques, like fingerprinting, like ballistics, like bite mark evidence, like tire track evidence, like fiber and hair, where the claim on the basis of the expert is that this is a match. I see the sample there from the crime scene. I see the one taken from the suspect. I've seen a lot of hair, right? I can tell you that has enough features. That has enough features to make it a match. DNA evidence is never articulated as a match. It's always articulated on the basis of the probability of a random match, right? So you can have equally, seemingly definitive declarations. The chances that this is not this are 1 in 600 billion, right? But they'll never say it's the same, yeah? And there are all sorts of interesting reasons why that's the case. So basically what happens in this Department of Justice Innocence Project and FBI report in 2015, they didn't retest any of the hair. There wasn't like a new hair analysis program that they were trying out. They went back to the court records, and when the experts said it's a match, when they used the language of identity rather than probability, and why would somebody before DNA talk in the language of probability, they were wrong. Yeah? So there you get the unsurprising underneath story, which is that in the 1980s they didn't use the language of probability, so they were wrong. Now there are all sorts of interesting things to think about in terms of how it is, what is it that actually undergirds and stabilizes regimes of truth? Who has access to the language of truth? And today, it is, it's the bots that are working up huge numbers of samples in a genomics lab, right? How many instances of bite marks in a hunk of cheddar cheese are there going to be around the world in order to be able to develop randomized kind of probability statistics, right? So I'm not saying that the FBI hair analysts got it right 100% of the time, but the idea that they got it wrong 96% of the time has got to make you think something else is going on rather than just that's bad science. But the way that it's actually presented in the newspapers, you saw this, it said something like how am I going to do this? The FBI basically made up science. What did it say here? There must be an easy way to do this, but you can review how exciting. Yeah, there you go. Pseudoscience in the witness box. Okay, so that's what we get out of that. But if you look under the hood, it's an interesting question, but it's certainly not what's in the headlines.
You've only just now touched on DNA analysis. Some humans are chimera. Is that an issue?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Some people are chimera.
Chimera.
Does that matter?
Chimera, I'm just like a humble historian who, actually my last science class was when I was at the age of 13. So can you explain to me what you mean?
Genetically, we might carry two completely distinct
Right.
lines,
Yeah.
cell lines.
Sure. Absolutely, that would be deeply problematic, wouldn't it? I mean, that would be a fantastic premise for a TV show, and in fact, so I teach this course from Sherlock Holmes CSI. So we start with The Hound of the Baskervilles, and we end with an episode in CSI in which effectively the chimera story is there. It's not chimera DNA, but it's called Harvest. It's one of the early episodes in that long-running series, and there it's basically about marrow transplant and how it is that if you actually transplant marrows as the again, pardon my lack of some scientific nuance here, but as the factory for DNA. The blood of the victim and the blood of the murderer were the same, right? So yeah, anything that problematizes the foundational assumption of a stable technology that the fantastic thing about DNA is that it individualizes, and the great thing is that we are all individuals. If you can mess with that, you're in business.
Go on right at the back.
I'm aware that there's tens of thousands of rape kits that have not been processed in America because of economic issues.
Sure.
And there's a number have been funded by charities or legal moves.
Yeah.
And do you think the economics of science, that not everyone can afford access to that? But, in this country there's been commercialization of the forensics.
In this country,
the availability and the depth and the validity and the thoroughness of the practice.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, again, the whole kind of, the commercialization of forensic provision is an important and a vexed question, both here and in the U.S. I mean, one of the consequences of the privatization of the Forensic Science Service, which is basically what it is that you all had until about 5-6 years ago. I mean, the CSI book that I signed lots of copies for, so I hope you're interested. Basically, it's part of that is about how it is that the Forensic Science Service came into being. It closes on the basis of kind of market calculation and kind of inefficiencies, and is sent out for tender in the late 2000s. And one of the consequences is that nobody wants to invest in bite mark analysis anymore, or tire or shoe print. If you've got a case in the UK now, my friends in the non-DNA forensic world tell me they got to send them to Switzerland, because they still have a publicly funded thing where they do kind of basic research, which is about more than simply the thing that is going to be able to be turned to a profitable case, right? So that's one consequence. In terms of rape and the U.S. and the Innocence Project, I mean. So one of the things, okay, so here is, I'm going to now take you on a reverse journey. So one of the things about the Innocence Project is its public face, and for all sorts of good reasons, is this, right? An African-American man, middle-aged, 50s, 60s years old, has been in jail on a rape case on the basis of a white woman's testimony, and has been languishing in jail for 20 years. And because the material evidence, the physical evidence, was retained, it was retested with DNA, and he's free. Okay, so that's the kind of the classic. I mean, it is interesting that when you actually get to the public representation of the public face of docuseries Innocence, it ain't this guy. It's somebody else. In the 1950s, with the Court of Last Resort, so the Court of Last Resort had its own TV show, which aired on CBS sponsored by Old Gold cigarettes. Another of, well, it is actually, it's part of the Gardner kind of, frontiersman thing. Of course it's going to be done with it. So is he really guilty? He served 19 years of a life sentence for the murder of a beautiful girl. His fiancée had turned state's evidence against him, but there was reason to believe he was innocent. Gardner styled himself as I guess in today's currency he'd be a libertarian, and possibly like a bit of a crazy libertarian that you sort of want to sort of move away from. He was all into frontier justice, rugged American, hated communists. And although he didn't hate African Americans, the African American question, especially in the Deep South, was complicated. And the readers of the Argosy magazine were not interested in cases involving those sorts of things. And the communists were actually agitating for these cases. So there are one of the things that's interesting about this is whose innocence matters, whose innocence counts, and whose innocence is actually going to be represented. And it's clear from the documentary evidence that Gardner systematically excluded African Americans, especially from Mississippi. And this is in the times when there's a huge kind of liberal upswell of concerns about lynchings of African American young men on the basis of presumed affront to white Southern femininity. Gardner's having none of this. Yeah? Doesn't necessarily make him, I haven't decided whether that makes him a bad man or not, but it certainly sort of frames the question for me about whose innocence counts and what are the social, cultural, political underpinnings which decide in any particular moment what an innocence regime is going to look like. I don't know if that answers your question, but it actually helped me to maybe put a little bit of meat on the bones as to why it is that I think this is actually, it's interesting to think historically about our contemporary moment of, because if we don't think historically, we simply think that that it's obvious that that the way that we are doing it now, and we understand why we're doing it now, because we have access to a transcendent technology of truth. Well, in the 1950s, they thought they had the same thing. Yeah, they used it for different purposes. Yeah, they had a different framework for running through that. But there are structural similarities which mean that it's not the same thing, but it's the court of last resort serves to some extent as an historical mirror that we can use to look on ourselves and see what it is that's historically specific about the way that we just understand things as being the way they are. And that's, to me, that's the point of history.
A question at the back in the middle, and then we've got time for one more.
Hi. Perhaps just following on from what you've just said and looking at the future as opposed to what's happened in the past. What, in this country, I believe, not being involved with it, we have an adversarial system.
Sure.
Where you have the police basically gather evidence and think whether they can bring prosecution, and then the defence has to counter all the prosecution has said, and that's all that's required. Yeah. I think the French, and certainly Conan Doyle, had an idea of an inquisitorial system in which you have a fair mind,
Yeah.
a very knowledgeable mind.
Yeah. I'd like to meet one of those one day, but yeah.
Where the key is that you need somebody who knows all there is to know about the thing.
Yeah.
And
God.
we haven't got so many people like that.
Right, no, we don't. No.
What I'm asking is, what's your view as to how we and justice is seen to be fairer.
Yeah.
Because they mentioned the O.J. Simpson case. I think pretty much most people thought, well, it's who you pay the most is going to win. Who's got the biggest reputation?
Yeah.
And that was more, and we've had cases like that since.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's interesting, and the problem of adversarialism is very much at the origins of the scientific expert witness as a special form of witness in the Anglo-American adversarial courtroom, right? So effectively, it goes that up until the late 19th century, late 18th century, the judge was the eye of God, right? And he would listen to witnesses, and he would, and the jury were there as actually kind of almost witnesses themselves. They were what was known as self-informing juries. So they were of the community. They knew that this guy Dennis over here, he's a bit of a drunk, and if this is just a neighbor of mine, he just happens to be on the first row, so. And sure, he fell down the well, and of course it was his mistake, not somebody else who pushed him, and we know this, right? And so the testimony would go that way, and there were no real kind of rules of what the jury could hear, right? Trials were very short, and there was actually no defense lawyer and no prosecution. There were no cases, right? Okay, so that's what happens, and over the course of the 18th century, that begins to change. You develop rules of evidence, in particular, rules against hearsay evidence and opinion evidence. Yeah, those are the two main. When you see Perry Mason saying objection, it's on the basis that this guy, I said that, Dennis was drunk. That's an opinion, right? You can say that Dennis was stumbling around, right? And that's that's direct eyewitness testimony. But if you draw a conclusion, that's an opinion, and that's excluded. The jury can't hear that. Okay, so the judge starts to be the referee of a much more complicated system, and that starts the framework for building a narrative, a complex narrative, on the part of the defense and the prosecution. Right, the expert witness is born out of this. We need to have some people that can speak to their opinion, which is based upon their knowledge and experience, and we're going to make them the ones that are not bound by exclusionary rules, right? So the expert is born as a freak, right? He's the only person that can act like the rules don't matter. Yeah, and that sets up a lot of debate over the course of the 19th century about whether the expert is actually just there to pursue their own cause, or to burnish their careers, or to take a fat paycheck by an expensive sort of client, and that I know that I'm going so this is what my course is like, right? So that is one model. So one model is that the adversarial courtroom creates conflict where we need clarity, right? The other model of and the problem is these money-grubbing scientists, right? Okay? That is a view from a certain position of what science is. It's a model of 18th century gentlemanly science where science was done as a hobby in the basement of some kind of, country estate. Yeah, I mean, think of Robert Boyle, right? I mean, you know, that's who he was. The problem is that in the 19th century, with not just the adversarial revolution, but also the industrial revolution, scientists are actually beginning to make money, right? They are beginning to have applied knowledge, right, that people, grubby industrialists, are willing to pay for, yeah? So all of a sudden, from the point of view of your country mansion, you've got this group of scientists who are creating new things, but not for the love of, not for God's purposes, but for, you know, for lucre, yeah? From the point of view of the money-grubbing scientists, they say, look, this is the free market. Sorry, this is the free market, right? This is, adversarialism is like market capitalism. It's like, it's competition. You test knowledge just like you test things. And the best, and the best ideas, the best outcomes will emerge, and they will emerge through contest. And the adversarial courtroom it's like the stock exchange or something. It is the crucible in which knowledge is tested. So you have, I mean, you know, I don't know which one you would want to side with, but there are principled arguments on both sides. So I think that the idea that the adversarial courtroom is in and of itself the problem, I think misunderstands, you know, both the history of where it is that the expert comes from, but also the nature of argument and where knowledge actually comes from, and who decides which knowledge counts as truth. Yeah? Okay.
All right, I think we have run out of time. I think you should do a podcast. I think we would all listen to your podcast. I hope you've enjoyed your evening. Thank you all very much for coming along and for joining in the discussions. And thank you very much to Professor Burney for his fascinating insight. Just a final plug for our forthcoming events. We have some more on our website at www.manchester.ac.uk/yourmanchester. But thank you again for coming, and please do join us for drinks and canapes in the foyer, and we wish you a safe journey home. Thank you very much.
Can I get you a glass of wine ready?
Sure.
White or red?
Have some wine.
White, right. I'll go and get it.
I wonder how being in the United States is going to change the way you think about this.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, or I'm going to have to hold fire, right? Because this is not the way right-thinking people think about this.
Oh, no, I mean, I was just thinking of our recent, the Me Too movement in the States is very intense.
Yeah.
And ideas about innocence and who's innocent and sort of contestations on gender, really on gender grounds.
I know. But don't you think then that what I'm doing is going to be taken as being an apologist for the poor guys who are just
I don't think
they're just being framed by a particular kind of matrix of I'm a little bit nervous.
I mean, I think it'll be interesting.
Yes, I think you're right.
You'll have to be ready for that, but it's the kind of argument that someone that Trump is making.
Yeah.
For white men.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, thanks.
That was a very good answer, but you only gave half of it.
Okay, so what's the other half?
What are the which actually is what I was getting at. You gave an answer which was only on the side of the discussion about the adversarial system.
Right. So what about the?
What about the other one?
Yeah.
And
What
that's
about?
the thing? See, with his paint spatter, no, his blood spatter. I don't know, and most of us don't know
Thank
what
you.
happens when you hit somebody about the head with a with a blunt instrument.
Yeah.
So we have no idea.
No, we don't.
Yeah. How blood actually gets anywhere at all? Is it because of the blood, the pressure of the blood, the heart rate, the heartbeat? Is it, so therefore where you make the break? Or is it the flinging of blood off the thing that
Absolutely.
you're whacking with?
Yeah. I think the answer is probably yes to all of those.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so
if
then you
you
then you need somebody who is the constituted authority that will be able to integrate all that
That's
and
right, because
that doesn't exist.
Because what you said was the answer of the aim was the answer. The guy went in there and said he did it. Let's gather the evidence to show that he did. Whereas, if I was my wife, and I was saying, do I need to, what can I do to save her? I had blood all over me, but I wouldn't have the splatter. And I wouldn't hide my clothes. You see what I mean? So it's always it's like the thing we did now. You need that kind of mind. And what I'm saying, that is all the drama that we have. No, I said that is an inquisitorial. The drama itself is an inquisition. It's not. This is what the prosecution said, and this is what the defence said. It might have those elements, but for us as the viewer, it's an inquisition of everything.
Absolutely. No, I think that's right. And I think that there is a contemporary movement in forensics, because basically the forensic world is at each other's throats. There is one school that basically says, look, the debates about forensic evidence are too oriented towards what is admissible in court. And basically what we need to do is to take an intelligence-driven approach, right? Which is that the police can know, can have, and can follow suspicions.
Yes.
And it's only the results of those investigations. And this is basically, this is around terrorism, right?
Yeah.
And basically, we need to suspend, either, we need to suspend kind of, rules of evidence and admissibility in order to go after the terrorists, right? And so this model is, people are importing it to sort of everyday cases.
We're looking at a lot more people reserving judgment.
Well, yes,
Because you say these guys could be innocent and they're just mucking about as they last.
yeah,
Or they could be up to something which we really need to think.
exactly.
But I remember the first time I realised how important it was. Because I was at work and I got through this door from the office to the workshop. And this, I was only working it, and he said, "Boy, what?" And I went, "What?" He said, "You just come through this door." I said, "Yes, I do." And he said, "This has got a brake glass on it, and you just smashed it and come through." And there was the brake glass broken.
Right. But you didn't do it.
I didn't do it.
Right.
And I said to him, "Fine. But if I had done it, there'd be broken glass on the floor, wouldn't there?"
Right.
And he went, "Oh."
Right.
Now that just shows you that instantly you've got somebody who's thinking around that. And I got him to do it, to just analyse the whole situation. The prima facie case, broken glass, person just gone through it.
Scruffy young person.
Whatever.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
Now, if that was the only evidence you had, then I could be convicted of that.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
But because I said, look at that, what isn't there, and what's inconsistent with your story.
Yeah.
At the very beginning, before the scene was wiped.
So you think we should put our cases in the hands? Basically, we need to figure out who Sherlock Holmes is, and that we need to find him.
That's right.
And then we